If it's Monday, new reporting on how Democrats in Washington are trying to jumpstart Biden's struggling presidency and campaign by invoking two words to rally both Biden's supporters and donors: Trump and impeachment. Plus, devastation and the desperate search for survivors in Morocco, where the death toll has risen to nearly 2,700 people, with thousands more injured and displaced after the region's worst earthquake in more than a century. And America remembers 9/11. President Biden will be speaking this hour to mark 22 years since the deadliest terrorist attack on U.S. soil, as most Republican presidential campaigns hit pause on politics to mark the moment. But not all. Hello and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles reporting in Washington, and with my Buffalo Bills kicking off soon against the New York Jets, what better way to segue to today's top story in politics? With Democrats here in Washington trying to go on offense to get voters and donors to rally behind a flagging presidency and sluggish re-election campaign. And what better ways to do that than using the specter of a second Trump presidency and a potential Biden impeachment inquiry? We have new reporting this afternoon from myself and our NBC News Capitol Hill team that Democratic Congressman and House Oversight Committee ranking member Jamie Raskin has been holding meetings with Democrats as late as last night to strategize about an aggressive plan of defense for President Biden, even before Republicans formally launch an impeachment inquiry. According to a source in the room, Raskin put it this way. Quote, the Constitution says the standard for impeachment is treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. They don't have anything like that. And in a new memo, Raskin described the Republican investigation as a, quote, total bust and an epic flop, saying the evidence gathered doesn't support their claims. I'll talk to Congressman Raskin in just a moment. To be sure, though, a vote to formally launch an impeachment inquiry isn't yet a slam dunk for Republicans. In fact, far from it. Republicans in moderate districts are concerned about going full bore into that kind of a partisan warfare, and even folks inside the most conservative parts of the Republican caucus have their disagreements.
I believe and have publicly stated that we need to pursue an impeachment inquiry and go down that road. I think the evidence is overwhelming. I think the corruption is very clear.
There is not a strong connection at this point between the evidence on Hunter Biden and any evidence connecting the president. The time for impeachment is the time when there's evidence linking President Biden, if there's evidence linking President Biden to a high crime or misdemeanor. That doesn't exist right now.
Now, at the same time, my NBC colleagues at the White House have new reporting today from inside the Biden campaign as it tries to boost a lackluster fundraising effort. Campaign officials and officials familiar with the strategy tell NBC that they intend to focus more on former President Donald Trump as a threat to democracy, which was a key tenet of a successful 2020 campaign. Now, both of these moves by Democrats, the emerging and aggressive impeachment defense, plus the push to use Trump to kickstart campaign cash, suggest that Democrats recognize that they do have some political problems. And it comes as the latest polling shows that voters are not inspired by President Biden and want someone else to run. Much of that concern is among Biden allies, and it's tied to his age and fitness for office, even as he wraps up a long trip to Asia to meet with world leaders. But even halfway across the world, Vice President Harris was forced to dodge questions about her boss's abilities.
The Wall Street Journal had a poll showing 2/3 of Democrats say Joe Biden is too old to run again. Are you prepared to be commander-in-chief?
Yes, I am, if necessary. But Joe Biden is going to be fine. And let me tell you something. I work with Joe Biden every day. Under Joe Biden's leadership, we have transformed and are in the process of transforming America's infrastructure with an historic investment in not only roads and bridges, but high-speed internet, what we are doing around issues like lead pipes, and I could go on and on.
And joining me now on set to talk about this is NBC News White House correspondent Ali Rafa and Amy Walter, who's, of course, the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report. That's not jet green that Amy's wearing either, right?
No, it is more of a gray.
More of a gray. Okay, yeah, good. Fair enough. So, Ali, walk us through this reporting right now with you and your colleagues about the president's advisors. How do they think that this pitch basically reminding everyone about Donald Trump is going to help them with fundraising? And do they hope it could light a fire with their Democratic supporters?
Well, they certainly hope so, and we're expecting the next FEC filing deadline at the end of the month, with those results coming out in mid-October. And their first results of their first quarter revealed that their high-dollar donations had been very successful. As a matter of fact, a lot of the high-dollar amounts had come out from high-dollar donors that had legally maxed out their donations, so they couldn't legally give any more during this 2024 campaign cycle. Their small-dollar donations, though, are lagging. The campaign, in an official comment, is saying that that is not the case, but we spoke with allies and with officials who say that there's just a lack of enthusiasm, that there's still a disconnect in getting those grassroots donations, those smaller donations, really to ramp up. And that could be because we really haven't seen the sort of enthusiasm that we saw in 2020 with the Biden campaign using these arguments of threats to democracy or using Trump more directly. And so we expect them to take a few steps with this new approach. We're going to see more of Biden attending these fundraisers. There's going to be more of them. There's a whole effort to recruit 1,000 new fundraisers by January to focus on those small dollar donations. There's going to be new merchandise, new messaging, but that lean in towards Trump is what's going to be the most noticeable and important to get these voters back.
So that's a noticeable shift, but is it something that we're going to hear from the president himself? He seems to avoid talking Trump at all costs.
Well, remember on Labor Day when he gave that speech to union workers, that was pretty much the sharpest, most direct mention that he had given of the former president, and it was still without mentioning him directly by name. So we're expecting sort of the same so far, but it's going to be this approach so far has been seen by some Democratic allies as risky. The fact that he hasn't really taken advantage of Trump, his unraveling legal woes. And so this is something that we're definitely going to see a difference in messaging. And some Biden allies are saying that they expect to see an influx of donations, not just when Trump's trials start in March, but also when they expect him to become the nominee.
So is this the general election? Is it underway, Amy? Are we not even worried about the Republican primary contest anymore?
I'm going to still pay attention to the Republican primary contest. I'm not willing to put it away yet. But look, Donald Trump is right now set to be the Republican nominee based on what we're seeing today. And I think Allie's point is a really good one, is that, look, once Donald Trump becomes the nominee or comes very close to being the nominee, once we turn the page into 2024, if he wins Iowa, he goes on to win New Hampshire, I don't think they're going to have any trouble raising small dollars to get that fundraising up and off the ground. Donald Trump is not the day-to-day reality that he was in 2020 when he was literally in front of people every minute of the day from the White House.
Right. Sometimes in those COVID press conferences.
He was a constant presence in your life, which gave Democratic donors, even more impetus to hit that send button on their ActBlue and their small dollar donation. So I don't know that he's going to have trouble doing that. And I do think the more that impeachment talk starts to ramp up, that's probably likely to help him raise some of that money as well. I also think a lot of Democrats, quite frankly, they're just not paying attention.
Right, yeah.
It is. I remember talking to Democrats after the 2020 election, pretty deep into 2021, who said, after Trump lost, I stopped paying attention.
Yeah, right.
He's not there anymore. So as soon as he comes in, whether that's his trial or whether that's as the nominee, I don't know that they're going to have trouble generating the kind of small dollar fundraising.
Is this an example of them going back to what works? I mean, this was basically their strategy in 2020, paint Trump as a threat to democracy. The alternative will be better under any circumstances. Instead of running on his record, are they going to make it about Trump again?
Well, you have to do both.
You got to do both.
Right. Which is to say, I'm the incumbent president. Things are getting better under my watch. That would be the message that I would expect to hear more from him personally. At the same time, making the very clear distinction with your opponent. You saw this in 2011 and 2012. You had Barack Obama, who was presiding over an economy that people still felt wasn't up to where it should be. Obviously, it was better than where things had been in 2009, but a real deep frustration that things hadn't gotten better. So while they were talking on the one hand of things going in the right direction, they also were making a very clear contrast with Mitt Romney, who they sort of were able to to make out to be somebody who didn't care about regular voters.
Right. So, Allie, of course, the president on his way back from G20, a trip to Vietnam, but Democrats still seem to be really concerned about his age and his fitness for office. Let me show you this poll. The Democrats' biggest concern about President Biden as a candidate, overwhelmingly, it's his age, 49%. There's some concern about mental competence, health, and things along those lines. I mean, are they hoping showing him on a stage like this, staying up late at night, giving press conferences, will demonstrate that he's still up to the job despite his age?
Well, you have to think of the two arguments here. We saw the president make some comments in jest about the time difference and his schedule. At one point, he said, what time is it? Or I'm going to go take a nap. Right. We heard a Vietnamese government official essentially say, you haven't aged a day since the last time I saw you in 2015. So even if the Biden campaign and President Biden didn't want age to be thought of when viewers were looking at this and voters were looking at this, it was a reminder by just hearing these comments. But the Biden campaign and the White House, for their part, they're just hoping to show that with this hectic schedule, that this would be a trip that would really knock the wind out of anyone. Right. And that we saw an 80-year-old president take it in stride and was able to successfully complete the trip while also holding some sidebar meetings with world leaders. Okay, we're going to leave it there. Ali Rafa, Amy Walter, thank you both for being here. We appreciate it. Now, to discuss this is Congressman Jamie Raskin, a Democrat from Maryland, and, of course, the ranking member on the House Oversight Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And just tell us right out of the gate, why take such an aggressive preemptive stance on impeachment now? Talk us through the timing and the thought process as it relates to the release of this memo.
Well, we've been hearing our Republican colleagues say that they will not pass a budget on September 30th or participate in the budget process unless there's an impeachment investigation launched against Joe Biden. So we can see where the MAGA caucus is headed, and we know that they've been pretty much driving the ship over there because there's just a 4-vote margin, and so McCarthy is really beholden to the most extreme faction of the Republican conference. And so we wanted to get on top of it. We've spent 7 months on this. They got pretty much all the evidence they could have asked for, all they wanted, more than 12,000 pages of documents, all of these witnesses, and it's all produced one conclusion, which is that Joe Biden hasn't done anything wrong. There's no wrongdoing by Joe Biden. Say whatever you want about Hunter Biden and what's going on with the U.S. attorney or the special counsel's investigation as to the tax charges and the gun charges. None of it touches Joe Biden. And the constitutional standard is treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And they haven't shown any wrongdoing at all. And we even have Republican colleagues who are acknowledging this and saying, hey, we better not go down this road. So we want to get on top of it and say this is a really dangerous direction that the Republican caucus appears to be headed down right now.
And you mentioned that 4-vote margin that Republicans have, and I wonder if this is part of your thinking by taking such an aggressive preemptive stance here. And you mentioned some of the Republicans that have expressed a level of reluctance in moving forward with an impeachment proceeding. The Speaker said he's going to bring it to a floor to a vote. I know that you're trying to convince the public that there isn't any there, but are you also trying to reach out to some of those more moderate Republicans that may have a difficult time voting yes on an impeachment inquiry?
Well, I mean, we certainly want to solidify anyone who is simply registering the obvious at this point, which is after 7 months of this wild goose chase, aimless fishing expedition, they haven't found anything on Joe Biden. And in fact, what you really have is people like Lev Parnas, who was Rudy Giuliani's right-hand man in gallivanting all over the world looking for a story against Joe Biden, coming forward and saying, there's nothing there, and you haven't shown anything, and he's explicitly called on Chairman Comer to call off the wild goose chase. So, before the country is plunged into another unnecessary crisis provoked by Donald Trump, who's obviously demanding this, we want cooler heads to prevail. And we're looking for Republicans, Democrats, independents, everyone to come together and say, look, let's move forward on the real problems of the country. I mean, we've just been through the hottest summer in the record of humanity. I mean, we're talking more than 100,000 years. We've not seen a summer this hot, and it's likely to be the coolest summer that any of us will ever see again. And yet, instead of working on the problems of climate change and the nightmare that confronts us, they want to impeach Joe Biden for doing nothing.
Right. And I understand your concerns here, but the fact that you've decided to take such an aggressive preemptive effort against this, is it somewhat of a recognition, though, that this could be or maybe already is a political problem for the president as it comes to the allegations against his son, regardless of the facts? Is it something that's just not going to go away on its own?
I haven't spoken to President Biden or the White House about what I'm doing. I just think it's a major dereliction of duty in Congress for the country to be facing all of these problems and for us not being cooperative and working together to try to address those problems. President Biden has reached out numerous times to the Republicans on the Infrastructure Act. You know, I was there for 4 years. We had an infrastructure week, an infrastructure month, infrastructure day under Donald Trump. We just had no infrastructure bill. And Joe Biden brought us one in, I think, his second month in office, and we got it done. $1.2 trillion investment in the roads and the bridges and the highways and the internet and so on. Well, we can do that same kind of work. Why would we want to drag ourselves down into impeachment over a non-scandal? And I think it's because Donald Trump, who's obviously running for president, doesn't want to be the only guy on the ballot who's been impeached before. But he was impeached for good reason. He incited a violent insurrection against the union as determined by the House of Representatives and in a 57-43 vote over on the Senate side.
So let's talk, though, about the political implications of this. And I do want to show you a recent poll about the allegations as it relates to Hunter Biden and how that impacts the president. 57% of voters say it has no impact on them at all. 34% say it would make them less likely to vote for him. 2% actually saying more likely. Are you concerned that by bringing this out into the light, by talking about it, that you're actually giving air to something that might otherwise fizzle? How do you think that this could help the president?
Well, this is obviously the only thing that the GOP, certainly in the Oversight Committee, is talking about. I think the Judiciary Committee, their Weaponization Committee, this is what they're working on. I'm with the 57%. People understand Hunter Biden is an adult child of the president who's led his own life. He had a serious drug problem, which he's talked about and he's written about. And he got himself into some trouble, and the rule of law and the justice system is working there. And it's a Trump-appointed, originally U.S. attorney in Delaware, David Weiss, who's now the special counsel in that case. So the justice system is working, and their attempts to drag Joe Biden down with it haven't worked. But I hope that they look at it and say it's not worth going forward on that. And then we can work together on a whole bunch of serious issues that are confronting the country, including gun violence, which is out of control. Right. And we should put our heads together and come up with meaningful gun safety solutions, like a universal violent criminal background check. That's the kind of thing that the voters are expecting us to do and the people want us to do.
All right. Well, but let me just ask you, though, about the president's current standing as a supporter of the president. And I'm going to show you another poll. And this is a poll of Democrats. And it's Democrats who overwhelmingly say they would prefer a different candidate than the incumbent president, 67% to 33%. I understand the effort that you're making here to try and stave off impeachment, or at least slow down the impacts of impeachment. But there are issues regarding his age and some other things that seem to be resonating in this polling. Are you concerned that there's a lack of energy around the president's campaign as he seeks re-election at such a crucial time?
You know, I just completed a cross-country tour. I went to 9 states. I was in Colorado. I was in Michigan. I was in Pennsylvania. I've been all over the country. I'm in Kentucky right now. People definitely raise age as a concern, both about Trump and Biden, and people are asking when there will be a generational transformation in our politics, and undoubtedly that will come. But I also hear among the Democrats, since you raised my party, tremendous pride in the accomplishments of this administration, in the Infrastructure Act, in the Inflation Reduction Act, the most massive investment in climate action in the history of any country on earth, the dramatic reductions that we've made in prescription drug prices. I had constituents who were paying more than $1,000 a month for their insulin shots if they were diabetic. Now that's $35 a month. So I think there's a lot of pride in the progress that's been made. And, I don't know, how the country is going to deal with the age problem. It seems like, we've confronted sexism and racism and homophobia and so on, and ageism seems to be the one thing that's still with us. And obviously there are real issues there, and we need to have an honest conversation about it. But I think there's no comparison between the record of my party and the corruption and the lawlessness that are presented by Donald Trump, the twice impeached former president who's facing 91 criminal charges in 4 courts all over the land.
All right. Congressman Jamie Raskin, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, sir. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And up next, thousands are confirmed dead as emergency rescue and recovery efforts are underway in Morocco following this weekend's devastating and historic earthquake. We'll have the latest on the ground next. Plus, 2 of America's biggest foreign adversaries are deepening ties. All signs point to an imminent meeting between Russia's President Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We are following rescue and recovery efforts in Morocco right now following the devastating 6.8 magnitude earthquake that struck late Friday night. So far, more than 2,600 people have died and 2,500 more are injured, at least 1,400 critically injured in the quake. It's the largest quake to hit the region in over a century. CCTV footage from Friday night shows people in the city of Makarek fleeing falling debris the moment the quake hit. Search and rescue operations are ongoing as emergency responders race to dig through the rubble in the hopes of finding survivors. Aid teams from Spain and the UK joined those efforts this weekend. But as you're seeing in these images, rescue teams aren't just racing against the clock to find survivors. They're also dealing with the challenge of reaching these hard-hit areas. The quake appears to have destroyed some small, remote mountain villages close to the epicenter, and that has made it difficult for rescue teams to get crucial equipment and teams into the hardest-hit areas. NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley is on the ground in Marrakesh, Morocco, with the latest. So, Matt, what is the latest on the search for these survivors, and what are search and rescue crews up against right now?
Yeah, Ryan, I mean, the real thing that they're up against right now is, as you mentioned, the terrain. It's hard to get up into those mountains. It was hard before this earthquake, but now a lot of those roadways have been damaged. And there's still a real problem trying to get people out because the government, according to a lot of the people that we've been speaking to, they're not really there. We haven't really seen much of a presence there. And so this is still very much a struggle, trying to reach these people, trying to get aid to them. So this is something that is continuing. There's a real desperate search, but, there is that 72-hour window, the kind of golden spot, as rescue workers would call it, when they can expect to still find people alive. But Ryan, I was in Turkey back in February when there was a major earthquake, and they were still pulling people out of rubble 5-6 days later. So that might be something that's keeping people going. There is that 72-hour window, and we are up against that right now. But there's still the thinking, and we've seen this all over the world in disasters like this, that they can still find people. They could still be alive.
Well, the quake also hit in the Atlas Mountains. Has the government and any of the NGOs been able to get any aid into those remote areas? I mean, you mentioned already how difficult it is to get to many of these places even before a disaster like this.
Yeah, I mean, the government has been able to get some relief to these people. We haven't seen, as I mentioned, much of a government presence, and the government has come under pretty fierce criticism for that. We heard from a government official, really for the first time yesterday, saying that the government effort had been very good and very strong. But we didn't really see anybody up in the mountains. We have been seeing some footage released by the military showing aid being dropped from helicopters and airplanes. This is something that kind of helps them to get aid to these remote areas. But the idea of getting teams in, people who are capable, who have equipment to get people out of that wreckage, that's a whole nother story, and that's much more difficult. But the people that we've been speaking to when we were up in the Atlas Mountains earlier today, they said that most of the foodstuffs that they were getting was coming from civil society groups, not from the government itself.
And right now, what would you say are the most pressing concerns for the survivors in the aftermath of this earthquake? Have they been able to find safe places to shelter if their homes or places where they lived were destroyed?
Well, the village that we visited, there were people who were living in tents, and these were tents that they had built themselves, and that was a real issue. And it didn't seem as though they had much help, but as one person explained to me, these villages are basically like big families, so everybody was helping out. The problem is, in some of these villages, you're talking about large numbers of people who are dead. And that means that there's not the manpower to help extricate people who might still be alive under the rubble, or to build tents or to provide housing. The main challenge here, Ryan, is housing. And that's something that I think is going to be persistent, because unlike in Turkey, where you could simply basically drive up to a lot of these sites and provide all of this food, these are remote areas. And, it's very difficult to get access.
Okay, Matt Bradley on the ground in Morocco. Thank you for that, Matt. Let's turn now to the ongoing war in Ukraine. The Kremlin is confirming that Vladimir Putin has invited North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to Russia for a meeting in the coming days. And in fact, multiple news organizations are reporting that Kim appears to have boarded a special train bound for Russia, presumably for that meeting. NBC News has not yet confirmed that reporting. But the Biden administration has been warning that arms negotiations between the two leaders have been, quote, actively advancing. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel joins me now from Dnipro, Ukraine. So, Richard, what do we know at this point about this potential meeting between Kim and Putin?
So it has finally been confirmed by the Kremlin. Putin's own spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said that this is an official state visit. So when Kim Jong-un eventually arrives, and South Korean media are saying that his armored train was spotted departing, heading toward Vladivostok, which is just across the border. Russia and North Korea share a border. It's not very big. It's the smallest of Russia's land borders, but it is still a direct border. I've been to this area. I've seen that North Koreans will often cross the border there. There are North Korean work gangs that work for Russian companies. So the Russian companies will pay North Korean employers and use them for heavy construction. So there are a lot of ties already. And according to Dmitry Peskov, this will be a state visit with official delegations carrying out negotiations, a bilateral meeting with President Putin, state luncheon, and one would assume that all the trappings that come with an official state visit in Russia, including some sort of military parade. This is exactly what North Korea has been looking for many years, this kind of recognition and international role to be desired and useful to its more powerful northern neighbor. And also, right now, Vladimir Putin needs something that North Korea has and has in abundance, which is artillery. This war here in Ukraine is extremely costly in lives and in terms of artillery. And you're seeing the United States, which is struggling to keep up with the artillery demands on the Ukrainian side, has been sending cluster munitions. And on the Russian side, they've been using drones. They've been buying drones from Iran. And now it looks like they are, or potentially going to quite soon, be receiving vast quantities of artillery and missiles from the North Koreans. And in exchange, according to U.S. officials, the North Koreans would not only get food aid, which they badly need, get some technical assistance for their own military program, potentially their nuclear program, submarine program. So they also have a lot to gain from, not just prestige.
Well, and Richard, we don't think of North Korea as being a country that can provide someone else aid. We don't have that much time, but is this an example of desperation by Putin in the Kremlin?
I think it's more pragmatic. It's desperation because they have to go to North Korea, which is a rogue state. But Vladimir Putin is now can't travel abroad because he's considered an international war criminal. So do you have a rogue state going to another rogue state? If you want to call that desperate, that's just really name calling. But what we're seeing here is Vladimir Putin reaching out to North Korea because North Korea has something that he needs right now. How many times have we told the story of all the guns pointing from North Korea down at the city of Seoul? Well, all those guns are artillery pieces, and they all carry the kind of ammunition and artillery rounds that Vladimir Putin needs right now to fire at Ukraine.
Okay, Richard Engel, thank you so much for your reporting, and please stay safe. Up next, it's been 22 years since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the nation is marking the moment from ground zero to the campaign trail. You're watching Meet the Press now.
I join you on this solemn day to renew our sacred vow. Never forget. Never forget. We never forget. Each of us, each of those precious lives stolen too soon when evil attacked.
Well, welcome back. That was President Biden, of course, just moments ago, speaking on the 22nd anniversary of 9/11. Right now, his remarks are still ongoing. He's at a military base in Alaska on his way back to Washington from Asia. The remarks come as the White House announces an additional $4 million to the National September 11th Memorial and Memorial Plaza in New York. And there was, of course, a solemn ceremony at Ground Zero this morning where more than 2,700 people died when two hijacked planes flew into the World Trade Center. Each of those victims' names was read aloud, as it has been every year since the attack. At the Pentagon, where nearly 200 people died when a plane crashed into that building, the names of each victim were also read. First Lady Jill Biden participated in a wreath-laying ceremony at the Pentagon 9/11 Memorial just a few minutes ago. And, of course, a similar ceremony was held today in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where another hijacked plane crashed into a field after passengers thwarted the hijackers' efforts to target the Capitol. And in a reminder of the ever-increasing toll this tragedy continues to have, the Uniformed Firefighters Association says that 341 first responders have now died from post-9/11 illnesses, roughly the same number of firefighters who died in the attack on the World Trade Center. This year's anniversary, of course, comes in the midst of a Republican presidential primary. Former Vice President Mike Pence attended a 9/11 remembrance ceremony in Iowa. And he wrote an op-ed saying, quote, "Isolationism only makes America and the world a more dangerous place. If America were to step back from her leadership role on the world stage, it would create a vacuum that China, Russia, and other hostile nations would be more than happy to fill." Joining me now from New York City is NBC's Vaughn Hilliard. So, Vaughn, which candidates did we see today, and how are others in the field remembering this anniversary?
Right here in New York City, Ryan, we saw Vice President Kamala Harris as well as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis at the 9/11 memorial service here this morning alongside Mayor Rudy Giuliani, Michael Bloomberg, current Mayor Eric Adams, New York Governor Kathy Hochul. But you also saw Mike Pence, who was in his first year of serving in Congress in 2001. He was in Iowa here today. He also put out an op-ed in which he called out those who have called for American isolationism, referencing the 9/11 attacks and the importance of having American interests overseas and abroad. And you're looking also at the likes of, Ron DeSantis, who was in college at the time of the 9/11 attack, but joined the military and the Navy as a lawyer in 2004. He served stints at Guantanamo Bay as well as Iraq. And of course, Nikki Haley is somebody who is married to her husband, who's currently deployed in Africa, but also served a year-long deployment in Afghanistan in 2013 as a member of the South Carolina Army National Guard. And so when you look at the Republican candidates, Will Hurd, another, who served in the CIA in the aftermath of 9/11, in the counterterrorism unit, serving stints in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. And so this is, a reality when you're looking at those in power and those seeking power in the 22 years since the 9/11 attack. Individuals who have very different lived experiences. Of course, in 2001, Joe Biden was in his 28th year in the U.S. Senate and serving as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time.
So, of course, 9/11, Vaughn, not typically an anniversary that's often politicized, but it seems that's a little bit different given Pence using this opportunity to write this op-ed about isolationism. Is it clear that this was directed at anyone in particular, perhaps Vivek Ramaswamy, who has taken a more isolationist approach in his campaign rhetoric?
Absolutely. You saw Mike Pence go on the attack against Vivek Ramaswamy in last month's debate in Milwaukee. And it's important to note, Vivek Ramaswamy will be here at the 9/11 Memorial in New York City just a few hours from now. Of course, Ramaswamy just last month opened up fodder to 9/11 conspiracy theorists when he pointedly stated that he didn't know whether it was an inside job or not. He was widely condemned for his remarks that opened up air time to those 9/11 truthers. And so when you're looking at the politics of 9/11, Vivek Ramaswamy was in high school at the time of the attack, and clearly was somebody who was somebody who lacks a great extent of knowledge around the attacks in the aftermath of it. You also mentioned the politics of it. I think it's important to note Donald Trump, we are not exactly sure what his whereabouts or plans are today, and it's typically customary for former presidents not to go on the attack. But in just the last few moments, Donald Trump posting on his Truth Social account, quote, "The one thing I never understood about politics, who the hell would ever vote for crooked Joe Biden?" Of course, Donald Trump is somebody who has not abided by customs of American politics over the course of these last 8 years, Ryan.
That's a pretty fair analysis, Vaughn. Thank you so much. Let's talk about this now with our panel. Nicholas Wu is with us, a congressional reporter for Politico. Simone Sanders Townsend, the host of Simone on MSNBC and a former senior advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris. And Stephen Hayes, the editor and CEO of The Dispatch, and he's also an NBC News contributor. And Nick, I want to start with you because you're involved on a daily basis in this debate in Washington over Ukraine funding. And it's interesting, we're only 2 decades removed from the 9/11 terrorist attacks. It's the Republican Party that's suggesting that America should no longer be the policeman of the world and are, pushing back big time against Ukraine funding. And it's just interesting in the context of 9/11 to think about how the party's changed.
Well, I think we've seen this evolution over the past few years, and especially as the bipartisan consensus on Ukraine started to crumble a little bit in recent months, as members of the Freedom Caucus and others on the right want aid to Ukraine conditioned or perhaps cut altogether. Mm-hmm. It's a sign that some in the party are trying to turn away from these overseas entanglements and want to place more constraints on this funding.
But they're not all. There's certainly a loud vocal group of House Republicans that don't feel that way. But the leader in the Senate on the Republican side doesn't feel that way. Listen to what Mitch McConnell said from the Senate floor just a few minutes ago.
To rebut one ad hominem accusation in particular, there's nothing neoconservative about support for Ukraine. Helping a democratic partner defend its sovereign territory against an unprovoked attack from a common enemy is obviously in America's interest.
Stephen, neocon, on the Senate floor. I mean, what's your take on where the Republican Party is on this issue?
Well, I mean, if there's a word that's been more misunderstood or more misused than neoconservative, I'm not sure what it is. Look, there's a fight inside the Republican Party. The Republicans who are supporting continued funding for Ukraine are winning that fight. Mm-hmm. There's a loud, as you said, Ryan, vocal minority who are making the opposite argument, something that would be closer to a neo-isolationist or a non-interventionist argument. I think some of them are making it based on principles. They think the United States should avoid foreign entanglements, and they've held those beliefs for a long time. It's also there are also others who are making it on a more opportunistic basis, sort of aping what Donald Trump has said, making arguments the United States shouldn't be involved anywhere. We have to refocus at home. Those arguments, though, I think are not consistent with the long history of the Republican Party. And, as you saw in the Mike Pence op-ed, most Republicans, not just the so-called establishment Republicans, but movement conservatives believe in extending American power.
Okay. So, Simone, let's pivot now and talk about the Biden campaign and this effort now by Biden and his associates to put Donald Trump more front-facing when it comes to their re-election bid. Do you think that's a smart tactic? Are they doing it too late or maybe too early?
Look, I think it's a necessary thing to do. Every single day, whether folks are watching their local news, MSNBC, NBC News Now, or opening up the paper, you are reading and hearing about Donald Trump and these other Republican candidates who are running for president. And unfortunately, you're not hearing just as much about the Biden campaign. You're not hearing as much about what Joe Biden is doing and saying because they are, in fact, not talking about Donald Trump. They have been very message disciplined to talk about their agenda. I think that so much is happening. You can't make the argument about the threat to democracy, and democracy is on the line, as a continued battle for the soul of the nation, as Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris are doing, and not talk about one of the biggest threats, Donald Trump.
Yeah, and Nick, the folks that we cover every day on Capitol Hill, they certainly believe that Democrats should be out and about touting the accomplishments of the Inflation Reduction Act and, of course, the big infrastructure plan. But the Democrats that you talk to, are they frustrated that Biden isn't going after Donald Trump more?
The Democrats I've talked to, yes, are very much interested in trying to tout all these different achievements that they've passed. But the difficult thing with attracting this much attention to the president is that it doesn't always play that well in swing congressional districts, especially ones where Donald Trump won. You see a lot of frontline Democrats tiptoe around the former president in some ways, and because their voters did at the end of the day support the former president over Biden, right? So you see folks in those sorts of districts talking more about legislative accomplishments and trying to make it a more local race than a more national one.
Yeah. So we do have the specter of impeachment that is hanging over the Congress when the Republicans turn, and Stephen, we have some reporting about how House Democrats in particular are going to be at the front edge of defending the president. We've seen impeachment backfire sometimes in political arguments, right? It certainly helped Donald Trump in some respect in terms in terms of his base kind of consolidating around him. Bill Clinton, when he went through it, also had a similar effort of consolidation. Is there a chance that if and when Republicans take this move, that we'll see a similar kind of group of Democrats come behind the president and support him while he's being attacked by Republicans?
Yeah, I think that would be what I would expect. I mean, I think it depends what you think the goal of the impeachment process is. Is the goal to impeach and convict Joe Biden because of some procedural, process that Republicans want to follow? It's not. The goal is to muddy him up. I think the goal is to make the case that, look, he didn't tell us a lot of things. There are serious questions about Hunter Biden. We can ask those questions in this inquiry. But more importantly, it's when people go to the polls in 2024, and if they're faced with a question about Donald Trump or Joe Biden, you'll have some people who have said, they're all criminals, they're all crooks, and that's how they'll make their choice.
Right. But is that as big a problem as his age, Simone?
Look, so I think that, first of all, impeachment, Nick talked about the Republicans or the Democrats that sit in districts where Donald Trump won. There are 18 Republicans that sit in seats that Joe Biden won. I think that impeachment is a very sticky situation for those
both sides,
frontline members.
Point.
I think when it comes to this thing about Hunter Biden and then the president's age, when it comes to Hunter, I like to scour the streets, Ryan, and talk to the regular folks on the Instagrams and when I'm traveling. And the folks that I have talked to, they're like, who doesn't have a family member who has been through some stuff? That is Hunter Biden. It is not the president. And so they have yet to connect what Hunter has done to Joe Biden. Now, maybe the efforts of some of the Republicans on Capitol Hill are trying to bridge that gap. But right now, there is no there for the American people. I think when it comes to Joe Biden's age, the president is old. Okay? So, it's just a fact of the matter. But are we connecting age to ability? And I think what you have seen from the Biden campaign is, that ad recently that they put out about President Biden's trip to Ukraine. They talked about how long he was on the train ride. He looked strong. There was all this dum, dum, dum music behind him. That was to show strength, to project that, if Joe Biden can make this long train ride and go out there and stand up to the bully that is Russia, of course he can fight for you here at home.
Right. And it ultimately comes down to that binary choice you were talking about before, right, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, this is the Joe Biden argument, right? It's not a theoretical choice. If it gets to a Trump-Biden race, it's Trump versus Biden, and they're taking great pains to make him look and sound strong, just the way that Simone suggests.
Okay, great guys. Nicholas, Simone, Stephen, Nick. I call you Nick. Sorry about that. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Still to come, back to school in a post-pandemic America. The FDA just approved new COVID-19 shots as classrooms struggle to cope with the pandemic's lingering impact on students and teachers. Details next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. An updated COVID vaccine could be headed out to the public soon after the FDA granted approval to new shots from Moderna and Pfizer this afternoon. The updated vaccines come as COVID case and hospitalizations are on the rise once again across the United States, and amid criticism that the FDA didn't move fast enough to get the vaccines out before the cases increased. The updated shots target a common Omicron variant of the virus and are authorized for anyone 5 years and older, but you won't be able to get one at your local pharmacy just yet. A CDC advisory panel has to first recommend their use for the public. That group is expected to meet tomorrow. And across the country and inside the classroom, students are back. Also returning, some familiar problems as students, parents, and teachers continue dealing with an educational hangover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier this summer, the National Center for Education Statistics released test scores for a nationwide assessment of 13-year-old students, also known as the nation's report card. Those results were alarming. Reading scores were down 4 points, and math was down a whopping 9 points, the highest drop in a half a century. And as schools look to turn the page and get students back on track, districts across the country say they just don't have enough staff. For more on how we can address the ongoing issues related to education, I'm joined by Dr. Peggy Carr, who's the commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics. Dr. Carr, we're so thankful to have you on. I am the father of a 13-year-old who is struggling with math right now. So these statistics speak to me. I mean, what are the biggest challenges right now for American schools and what they're facing as this new school year gets underway?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is a new year, but the challenges, well, they're front and center, as they have been for the past couple of years. We really need to stay focused on getting students back on track. Math in particular, your son is not alone, really represents our biggest challenge. These students need a lot of help. So recovery is our big.
It looks like we're having technical problems with Dr. Carr, but she's back. Dr. Carr, you froze there for a second, so just summarize where you're headed there.
Well, I'm going to come in on your 13-year-old son.
It's my daughter, actually. It's my daughter, but that's okay.
Oh, well, her too.
Yeah.
But math is our biggest challenge, particularly for 8th graders. You said your child was about 13 years old. Mm-hmm. That is where we're seeing the biggest challenge moving forward. But you know, it's about a lot more than the academic challenge. Mental health is something that schools are going to really need to focus on as we get into the new year.
And so, you know, this data released this summer just really shows how far these test scores have dropped, as you mentioned. But how do schools address something as widespread as this? Do they have to change curriculum? Do they change their methods? Do they change the way they score tests and the way students are learned? And at what time do they learn? Do students have to go back a grade? How do we fix this?
Well, you know, you bring a real interesting point to the table. One of the challenges classroom teachers are going to have is that the students are further apart than they were before. So the lower performers are lower than they were before. So teachers are going to have to figure out how to better differentiate instruction and meet the lower performing students where he or she is, and the student who's not struggling quite as bad. So it is going to be important to have really skilled teachers, and we really are falling short on having certified teachers, as you have said.
I come from a family of teachers. My father was a teacher. All my siblings are teachers. All my sister-in-laws are teachers, and they all talk about how everyone is just burnt out. And that's one of the reasons that you see teachers leaving in droves. How do we fix this? Do we go to a 4-day work week, something like that? Well, how can we reinvigorate the teaching profession?
Well, we certainly need more tasks on time. More time on task. Students need to be in school longer days, summer, all of that. It really has to be a real comprehensive approach to getting more time with students with these subjects. And you know, we have another new normal that we've got to turn around. Absenteeism is something that students are really sort of struggling, figuring out, well, do I really want to go to school? It has actually increased since COVID. And so we're concerned about that. So lots of challenges. You can't teach students if they're not in the room.
Yeah, right. Well, Dr. Peggy Carr, as always, terrific insight. We thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us this hour. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson straight ahead, but go Bills.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.